Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on elevating the end-to-end employee lifecycle with an intranet. So this is a particularly special webinar for me because I come from a bit of an internal comms background. I'll give you a little intro to myself, but I've enlisted the help of Jenny, who is Unilever's Chief People Officer. So it's a bit of a collab between, I guess, the internal comms view and the HR view. So my name is Kaz. I am a community and insights lead at Unilever. So it's my job really to get the on-the-ground insights from our customers and understand what that means for our industry, for employee experience. And I talk a lot about that at webinars like this and write blogs and post a lot on LinkedIn as well. I'm also joined by Jenny. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Kaz.
Hey,
shall I do a quick intro to myself?
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Shires. I'm Chief People Officer here at Unilever. I've only been here actually about 6 months, so I'm learning a lot about the intranet too. And it's been fantastic to work with Kaz to learn a bit more about the possibilities of really elevating what HR does through the lens of the intranet.
Nice. I was, when Jenny came into Unilever and we started to connect a bit more, the kind of like weaving of the HR and internal comms views has been great. And also I've been like particularly passionate about like showing what the intranet can do. And that's kind of what this whole webinar is about. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn if you have any like questions. I'm a bit of a keen bean on LinkedIn, so yeah, particularly keen. So in terms of our agenda, we'll have a little intro to frame the problem. I kind of want to explain why we did this webinar. We were ideating the best title and why. Then I basically want to explain why we came up with this idea. Then I want to kind of look at the opportunity of the life cycle. So this whole framing is around the employee life cycle, and some people are a bit more experienced with what the life cycle is, how it's structured, things like that. But also I'm kind of newer to that, and so I kind of want to hear a little bit from Jenny as to where we think the opportunities are to upskill in the life cycle, how we make it better with an intranet. Which brings us on to the third section, which is intranet interventions, which is basically I went away and heard from Jenny where we think the challenges, opportunities are in the life cycle. And I basically tried to come up with best in class examples from our customers using intranets to show how we deliver on some of that. And then we'll have like a lot of Q&A. So I've got my own questions that I've prepared for Jenny. And so get that Chief People Officer, CHRO type view, opinion on some different things. But also you'll have your own opportunity to ask questions as well. So you'll notice within the platform now, you'll be able to actually ask questions. So if there's something that comes to mind, either now or throughout the webinar, you can pose that question. You can also like upvote people's questions. So when I get to the end, I'll kind of pick the top ones. So let's dive in. For those of you that haven't heard of Unilever, we are an employee experience platform. I think of it as an intranet reinvented for the employee experience era. So we are a global business. We actually have about 5 million users on the platform now, so growing quickly. And we have all the kind of like security accreditations that you would expect. We just got listed as a leader by Gartner, Forrester, or IDC, all the big analysts that are wading in on the internet space at the moment. So I kind of want to start off, and every time I do a webinar, I want to make sure we capture a bit of data and insight from the people attending. We've got a good mix of employee experience professionals across IT, HR, internal comms, HR, and IT. So what I'm keen to know is hopefully you'll see a little poll pop up on your screen now. And I kind of want to know how often you're talking about the employee life cycle and all the terminology around that. So are you talking about the employee life cycle, referencing it daily, weekly, monthly, or is this your first experience with it? You're like, what the hell is the employee life cycle? So maybe you're one of these intranet techies that haven't spoken about the life cycle before. So you'll see a little thing on your screen now, and I am going to see what people are putting in. Cool, seeing some results come in. Interesting, there's a mix. So about 36% of people saying monthly, 30% saying weekly, 10%, oh, that's just jumped a little bit, 10% saying daily, And 20% say, what the hell is the employee life cycle? So we've got a real mix across all those different things. And it'll be interesting to know, actually. Feel free to drop in the chat in the comments around how you're using it. Are you coming in it from a HR perspective? Are you using the terminology when you're interacting with HR, or are you using this as a bit of an opportunity to get an insight on what that means? So moving on from that, I kind of want to explain why I felt so passionate about doing this webinar. So we did a little bit of a snap poll on LinkedIn, just to get a view across people following Unity. Do we think that the intranet is part of the HR stack? And that was the question we posed. And I honestly expected that maybe 20% would say no, and that the majority would say yes. That wasn't what we found. What we found was that it was basically 50-50. And so I was a bit shocked by that. So I basically wanted to convince you over the course of this webinar that actually, A, it is part of the HR tech stack, but B, that actually it's part of the employee experience tech stack, which is neither owned by HR nor internal comms nor any other department. It's people that are working towards delivering the best engagement scores, a good employee experience. So that's my mission in this, is to convince you of that. So let's frame the problem a little bit. So if anyone, I'm a bit of a EX geek, so I follow a lot of the data. I'm a hoot at parties. But this is, so this is the problem for me, which is that you may have noticed that overall engagement scores, so Gallup that measures them over for years, had a 1% uptick. And so it's not record low engagement scores, but it's pretty close. But here are some other problems that are part of the issue for me. Employees have record stress and burnout. In an era where we're looking for a bit more purpose-driven work, we're seeing record low connection to the organization's mission. And also, and this is the most worrying for me, is that, so this stat is UK specific, but actually doesn't really differ when you look at the kind of Western world, is that 51% of UK employees are planning to actively seek new employment in the next 6 months. That for me is so worrying. I guess from a business perspective, it hits the bottom line. But from a personal perspective, my opinion is that we're creating this revolving door of employees, which is not healthy and makes work feel like super transactional. And that for me is not a nice feeling. And so I want to affect some of that and show you some examples that hopefully help you improve those sort of percentages in your organizations. And this is where the life cycle comes in. So this, for me, for those of you that said that you weren't aware of the life cycle, this is exactly where I can bring Jenny in. But I'll tell you my idea of the example before we get into some detail from Jenny, is that there's some detail here of the different pillars of the life cycle. But for me, what's worth understanding is that the length of this employee cycle, i.e. how long an employee is staying in your organization, is defined by how well you do it. In particular, what you'll see there is you have these high engagement points around attraction and recruitment. And so these are tried and tested ways. You have people dedicated to recruitment, attraction. We do that quite well. And then you come off a bit of a cliff edge in the experience. It's variable. Sometimes it's terrible. And we know that from the engagement scores. And so what we want to do is help you, enable you, uplift that, elevate that, as we said in the title. So I want to hand over to Jenny, just to, coming from a HR people experience background, just to give us a bit of depth around understanding the life cycle, but in particular, where you think the challenges and opportunities are for an intranet before I show you how I can deliver on them.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kaz. Yeah, so I mean, essentially, in a nutshell, the employee's life cycle is just that sort of start to finish journey of an employee with any organization. And actually, it starts before they become an employee, because you're thinking about how you go out to market to attract talent into the business and how you recruit them. Those are the pieces that, as Kaz says, you tend to have high levels of engagement at that point because people are excited about joining a new organization. You're probably throwing quite a lot at them at that point, and then they join, and then you're thinking about, well, what are those life cycle moments that happen? And actually, so this is a good summary of that life cycle. There's little other moments that matter that you would pop into there, but this would be really what we're thinking about, what most people would think about as being the employee life cycle. And when we think about how the intranet can potentially make a big difference to this, both from a sort of employee experience, comms, and HR perspective, I think it's really worth us focusing today probably on that middle section, onboarding through to retention, and thinking about what we can do there and how we can make a difference. So in terms of onboarding, the data shows us very clearly that if you do a good job of onboarding people into your organization, your retention improves, and actually also productivity improves. So not only does the employee get a really good experience, but actually they also hit the ground running if you make a good job of this. And I think where the opportunities are as we think about intranet for onboarding, there's a few big pieces for me which really matter. One is that consistency piece, because actually you want to make sure that whoever that employee is, whatever their role is, however senior or junior they might be, there's certain information that you need everyone to have, and a certain type of experience that you want everyone to have, regardless of who they are or who their boss might be. So that consistency, it's also scalable. You can make this really scalable, because often onboarding kind of sits somewhere between HR and recruitment and comms, and nobody really quite owns it. And actually setting something up really effectively via an intranet can be a really scalable way to push this out, and make sure that consistent experience is driven in a really scalable way. And in terms of that productivity piece, just getting people the information that they need when they need it, not sending them everything on day one when they're already overwhelmed, they can't remember anyone's name, they don't even know where the loo is yet, isn't really actually that helpful. What you want to do is you want to stagger that information, be smart about when you're sending it, so that you're getting information and connections to people at the moments where they realize they need it. And so taking away the distraction of onboarding, making that more effective, can actually just get them up to speed faster, makes them productive, getting their job done even faster, which is obviously brilliant for the bottom line. And then there's a cultural piece in there too. If you're doing a good job of making sure that information is getting into their hands at the right moments, you're also freeing them up a little bit away from the admin of being a new hire and into getting absorbed into the culture, getting to know their colleagues, and becoming part of the community of your organization, all of which is a really good start for an employee coming in. So next up, development. I think there's a big opportunity here for the intranet to play a really key role in this part of the employee life cycle, because we know that where people feel they work for an organization, they actually might be quite happy with their current role. They might be quite happy with their compensation, their benefits. But if they don't see a future, if they don't feel that their line manager cares about their career, or that there isn't a clear career path for them, it's one of the biggest indicators of future attrition, and one of the biggest reasons that people leave organizations, which is a bad thing for all of us. So there's a few things that can really come into play here. One is obviously making sure they have access to quality training. So you can really use an intranet to host content or to advertise, what you might be doing, or to allow people access to specific training. But there's a bit more to it than that. You can really make sure that you're being clear about opportunities, about career pathing, about what opportunities might exist elsewhere, whether it's through an internal jobs board, but also in a bit more sophisticated way than that, helping people to identify where they may be gapped, helping them do, access training, not in a sort of very formal way, but in a micro-learning sense, or where they can dip in and out to things that interest them, or where they see gaps that they might have that they want to be able to fill. And then you can also be a bit broader than that too, and you can think about mentoring and coaching and how you can facilitate those types of relationships through your intranet, which is really, really valuable and a huge, huge engagement factor for employees. And then the last piece I really wanted to deep dive into is just retention overall. So good onboarding and good sort of learning and development, or development, will help with retention, but there's more to it than that. So we know that where employees feel a sort of a connection to their employer, a social connection or a values connection, their retention is going to be much stronger. And conversely, attrition is higher where you don't feel that your values are aligned with the business that you work for. So keeping your employees connected to your vision, your values, your purpose is super important. And actually, at its most basic level, the intranet at least helps you communicate what that is so that employees can figure out whether they align with it or not. But then it allows you to really figure out how you allow for that interaction, allow for participation of your employees to sort of be part of that culture, not just to witness it on a page, but to actually form part of the communities or the networks that they want to be part of. Allowing you to recognize contributions that your employees are making is really important as well. And all of that goes into driving that values-driven culture, which for most people is really fundamental to their decision whether or not to stay or go at a particular organization.
Cool. So yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, and with that, I'm going to hand back to Callum.
Oh, perfect timing. So that was super interesting for me. So it gives me a bit of depth. It gave me a bit of depth to work with, and this is basically the brief I had to go and find customer examples on. I particularly this retention one I'm interested in because I'm one of these. The data at the moment around value alignment and organizations and social alignment with employees is crazy. So I'm particularly excited to show you that one. But I want to start at the beginning. So, of course, we're just onboarding. So I referenced earlier going, and actually Jenny spoke specifically about overwhelmingness, the overwhelming content. I already see something in a question, just I had a bit of a sleep, around AI and chatbots. And I think one lens to look at actually all of these sections through is understanding the push and the pull, understanding when employees are actually pulling information towards them through things like chatbots or portals or knowledge portals, whatever it may be, versus when we're pushing communication, information, knowledge to them. So let's have a look at a couple of these things here. A point that I really want to pull out is kind of around consistency. And so what I did was basically look at customer examples who I personally thought were best in class at how they did it. And so the first example I've got of this is actually from Johnson & Johnson. And so what they essentially used their intranet for was to say, well, we look across the organization, there's a level of, in a global enterprise organization like that, there's so much inconsistency. There are small pockets getting great onboarding by their managers, but we have no idea what's happening. There's no standardization. People are telling us it's overwhelming. How do we fix that? Well, they started by quite literally, let's break apart the parts of onboarding and put it into logical milestones that we can work to. And so what you see here is basically starting to split that up on the intranet to say, hey, look, it's your first week. These are the kind of things we want you to achieve. And there are functional things. And for those of you working in HR, there are always the things that people have to get done in their first week. It's signing off the policies. It might be some mandatory training, all of that stuff. But what I like here is that they've kind of interwoven some of the social stuff, like meeting mentors. And I know that was something you spoke a little bit about earlier, about starting to build those social connections, whether in person or remote. And so for me, what's great about this is it's the breaking apart of what do you actually want me to achieve in my first week, in my first month, but also understanding that onboarding is, when you're onboarding, that process is not your first week. It's like, oh, check, onboarding is done. It's something much deeper and needs to be developed over time. And actually we need to be thinking about, 3-6 months in and how we support that, because there may be things that people send an email, and you said about information overload. I've seen some pretty worrying emails from day one, but I'll send you this information, which is a long email with about 10 logins, different systems you need, people you need to meet, and it's a bit overwhelming. And actually that's sometimes in the best case scenario. I've seen some in my previous organizations. I remember trying to work out who I need to talk to get stuff done or get access to stuff. And so this starts to break it down into something more manageable. And also it's an anchor, meaning where do I go to find out what I need to do? And they should be questioning, what platform do I need to go to? Who do I need to go to? It should be in the app, the intranet, which is the center of the digital estate for them. Next, and this is a particularly interesting one for me because the questions come up around kind of AI and what I don't, for me, there's a level of when you're starting, yes, there are the functional things you need to get done. There's the people you need to meet, but it's also, how can I start to show my interest in the organization? How can I start to learn, engage with different topics? For example, I know in Unily, we've got people that are super passionate about sustainability. How can you start to show your interest in different communities and different topics and different content that's out there? And what's really great, Johnson & Johnson do this as well, actually, but what's really great here is that it's kind of taken inspiration from experiences like if anyone has Apple Music or Spotify, when you onboard in those platforms, they go through a series of questions which ask you, do you like the Spice Girls? Do you like the Rolling Stones? What genres do you like? And it starts to tailor that experience in a way that is personalized and targeted, that works for you. Meaning, yes, we've got that consistent experience for employees, but how can we also start to make it feel like it's a bit of you? And so what you start to see here is these kind of guided experiences that ask the right questions and tailor the experience. So it feels, so the intranet feels like not just this like one-to-many communication tool, but something that feels like, actually, there's some content that's interesting for me here that makes me want to come back. Now, so this is a particularly interesting one. So as we were reviewing the content beforehand, I had a bit of a thought, which was like, there are so many events and webinars I go to where there's valuable content, and I write loads of notes, and do I ever go back to them? Do I action them? Probably not. Maybe that's a me problem. But I wanted to think about like how I support the people watching to actually put some of this into action. And it's not just about the tech. And I want to be clear about that. I know I've got loads of intranet examples, but for those of you, I'm sure there are people on the call that don't have an intranet or have a bad intranet. And so what we want to do is give you a bit of a checklist that helps you make progress towards that. So, and by the way, this will be downloadable after the webinar, so you don't have to like jot it all down now. But essentially, these are quite literal tasks that you can start to implement to progress in this area. As an example, before you get anywhere near the tech, you need to understand the problem, right? So doing little things like joining and onboarding, a new starter onboarding or orientation to understand like what information are they soaking in, getting feedback, for example, like quickly at those different points in time, like Johnson & Johnson understanding at the end of that first week, what's the feedback there versus the first month versus the third month. So not just, hey, you've finished onboarding, let us know all the feedback. It's being relevant with the feedback points. So I won't go through all of these in the interest of time, but there are some cool things here because you can start to action this stuff without any tech, which is understand the existing pain points, speak to HR. No doubt they have been working on onboarding and they probably have their own pain points that they will, I'm sure, elicit to you. So, and also little things like start to define the milestones. All of this stuff is outside of the tech. So, and also strip, like this one's pretty cool, which is around sometimes when you're looking to improve something, there can be a bias towards addition, but actually sometimes I think it's about subtraction. What can we strip away, simplify, rationalize, whether it's the amount of systems people need to go into, whether it's about the information, so looking at it through a different lens. But as I say, if you, after this webinar finishes, you'll get onto a little page, you can give some feedback, and at the bottom of that page, there is a link to download it as a PDF with the checklist across all the different sections. So the reason we do that is so you can start to do stuff like this. And when Jenny and I were discussing beforehand, we basically said, if you want to improve the onboarding experience, you've got to map it out, right? And it's not just about getting straight in that tech. The checklist I've given you there is so you can start to create something like this. And I know this is on a snazzy slide, but the reality is I'm a bit of a whiteboarder. So what I would do is bring the right people in the room, get Post-it notes or a digital alternative on the Miro board and start to put some of this together to understand who's getting involved, at what point, how are we communicating, and that's how you start to improve it. And then also understand how we start to overlay the intranet. So next, so we've looked at our onboarding. Now let's go to development. And development is an interesting one. So there's a stat we were looking at earlier, which is that I think Gallup estimates that 70% of your employee engagement score is attributable to the manager. And so how you get managers up to speed and is super important. And so thinking about how those things are overlaid into your intranet, but also understanding like how we develop people in the organizations. If there's anyone watching that has a large workforce of frontline workers, or you have a large number of people at entry level, people, especially the younger generations, looking at how they develop and grow. And we saw a stat earlier about that. So the example I've got for this, I'm so passionate about. We've just released a full case study with them. The reason I'm most interested in is basically because of it's in the hotel hospitality industry. And anyone that knows anything about that industry, it's the highest turnover industry. And so a lot of the problems we saw earlier around this kind of revolving door of employees, they know that. And so what it's doing here is, how can we support employees to stay in the business? So they're a luxury hotel. They want to deliver a great customer experience, but you can't do that with a revolving door of employees. So how can we make sure we have the right development program that's ingrained into our intranet? It's visible, it's communicated, and it's good. And so let's have a look at that example. So this is Kersner. So this is the case study I've got for you. So luxury hotels. And so first of all, before we jump into all the cool stuff around training and micro learning, I think I referenced on that slide, part of it is just, can I actually get my job done? Can I identify the knowledge in the organization? I'm sure so many people can resonate with this concept of like, to get that knowledge, you need to go and speak to Paul, who then directs you to Lisa, who then directs you to Jenny. And then so what we want to do is remove some of the barriers to getting that knowledge, democratize it in portals like this. And we've got customers that do it in different formats. That AI chatbots, for example, is a good way. But so what you see here is in front of you is democratizing that knowledge. So let's firstly, can the employee get the functional knowledge to do their role, but also maybe tap into little bits of knowledge outside of their remit to start to move towards developing over time. Moving on from that is, okay, so now I've got the functional knowledge to do my role. How can I then start to develop and understand where are the gaps? Where can I grow into? Where can I upskill? What's particularly interesting here is that Kersner, in their strategy pillar, they've got this terminology which basically says our strategy is to support and equip our employees to achieve self-mastery. And that language for me is quite unique, but it's also very clear. And it basically says, we're going to do a hell of a lot to help you with development, but this is a go-getter culture and you can own your experience. And yes, we may have a frontline heavy workforce, but we're going to make sure you can access everything on demand. And what's even cooler about this example is that, yes, there are the functional bits of learning, the processes, the training courses, which you can access here, but also they've taken a slightly different lens, which is that if you want to progress up through the organization, we understand it's not just about knowledge and skills gaps. It's also about things like personal branding, understanding LinkedIn and social, how you build your network inside the organization, these sorts of things. And so there's this lens of, we've got all the L&D here. We've got all the L&D here to support you in this brand, in your resort, to do a good job, and you can upskill these training, but also this kind of like personal branding, this softer element that starts to help people. Also, my personal opinion with this stuff is actually, like, I feel quite strongly about micro learning. I feel like this age of I'm not sure whether Jenny agrees with me, but we have these like training courses which where you like sit in front of a computer for 4 hours and you have bad acting that makes James Corden look good. And like, I question how many people are actually engaging in that, or whether they're just clicking through. Not that I would admit to that, Jenny. Of course, I complete my training. But
yeah, I know you do.
So it's not about a check in the box. It's about this go-getter culture. How can we develop and micro-learn? And so
and it's tapping into what people want to learn about, right? That's the most effective type of teaching, is where the student wants to learn. And so actually making that kind of learning and development opportunity easily available and accessible is, that's the way to make it hit home, because actually the one size fits all, everybody has to do it, is not actually a meaningful training much of the time. So it's that individualization, the consistent experience, the access, that are really going to be the differentiator and make people feel that there's an investment in them as individuals, rather than you have to do this because we say so.
Yeah, I love that. And also like this, embedding it into the communication, like talking about self-mastery, communicating it is super important. And also was going to kind of make a point here around like this on-demand element, which is that like you may be looking at this example in front of you and be like, it's a frontline heavy organization, but actually it's super important, especially when it comes to like diversity and inclusion. Like, can we access stuff on demand? Is it recorded? Can I access it in my language? These are things that we should be thinking about to level up the playing field so that everyone has equal access to develop. And so now we've got, in this Kersner case study, we've now got these employees that have started to take control of their experience, self-mastery, upskill in different areas, both functionally and non-functionally. And so now how can we ensure that people are primed to stay in the organization, right? They're in the business of delivering the best hotels in the world, right? You don't do that through a revolving door of employees. And so firstly, what you start to do is make sure every person can see every opportunity in the organization. And this isn't just at a local level. So it's not like what roles are going in my resort. This is what roles are going in every resort across the organization, in every brand that we own, in every location that we own. Because, as I say, this is the highest turnover industry. And so if they really want to compete on customer experience, you need people that can do it well. And so what's the outcome of this? Well, what it means is that they have these employees, for example. What's interesting about this particular industry is that if you're working at Atlantis, the Palm in Dubai, you're probably doing it because you're a bit of someone that likes traveling, for example, and there's this wanderlust in their employee base. And so instead of trying to keep people in this role in this resort, it's like, let's just lean into the employee wanderlust and be like, hey, we know you like traveling. Here are all the opportunities. And so what they have is then these employees that hop from resort to resort. And so when you're looking for opportunities for leadership and management, there is no one better qualified than people that have understood that business inside out, in different brands and different types of resorts and different sizes. And so what you create here is a great retention, great customer experience, so it hits the bottom line. But I guess what we're most interested in is, everyone on the call is hopefully looking at things like employee engagement scores and want to make sure that what you're delivering to your employees is good and that it's above industry average. And that's exactly what Kersner do. You see here that they've got 10% above their industry average, which is great. And they're actually listed as a Gallup exceptional workplace 2 years in a row. For a company like this in this industry to get that accolade, which is looking at best in class, I think is so cool, and shows that actually when you think about it and do the work to understand like what barriers can we remove, can people take control of their experience, this stuff is important and it has the outcomes, which is super important. And so this is our little post-webinar checklist for development. And so I won't go into it in detail, but there are little things, for example, understanding a list of skills that people can, maybe these softer skills, which is there may be people as part of their development that are delivering a presentation for the first time. Can they find people in their office, in their resort, that have those skills, presentation skills? And so I have a think about like AI was also come up again, is like sometimes for a lot of people that's overwhelming and they don't know where to start. Are there some techies in the organization that maybe want to help people with that? But also one of the things I wanted to talk about is like succession planning, keeping people in the organization, but also I know people are very well versed with communication campaigns, and we deliver on some of this stuff when it comes to holiday season or it comes to Pride, for example. My personal opinion is that we should have like a bit of like an internal mobility month campaign, which is that like, let's raise awareness of the fact that we have this portal and it gives you access to every opportunity. Do you know there are these courses you could do? And I think it's the sort of thing that deserves attention. So yeah, here's that little checklist for that. Moving on to our retention, and this is a particularly interesting one for me. We actually did some research at Unily where we interviewed and surveyed employee experience leaders, and we asked them to put their list of priorities down in order. And what came up, what we expected to happen was people to put, you know, in times of economic hardships with the economy, we'd expect retention to come up quite top, right? We spoke a lot a couple of years ago about retention over recruitment. That is not what we found. What we found is that recruitment came up second top on the list of priorities. Retention came up last. And so we tried to understand how and why. And so one of the conclusions I came to is that we don't have a retention blueprint in the same way that we have a recruitment blueprint. And so we know recruitment well, we have dedicated resources to it, and they've got that blueprint. And so what I want to do here is look at some of the points that Jenny brought up earlier, which is around purpose and vision and making sure we get the kind of right people in, that sort of thing, to ensure that it's not just about getting people in the door. It's not about heads, it's about the right people. And so the example I've got for this, I'm passionate about all my examples, but I've worked quite closely with the National Grid team, and it's one of those organizations, again, enterprise organization, very traditional, historic organization. And so how do you, as you can imagine, maybe sometimes struggle with recruitment? How do you make sure that when people come in, we get the right people in and that they stay? And so what they did was invest a lot of this into, let's make sure we have a really compelling, clear, layered vision, right? And so it's not just about a marketing slogan to get people in, it's something to ignite people. And so their vision here is to be at the heart of a clean, fair, and affordable energy future. So that's starting to set up front. We know the sort of people we want in this organization. It's people that are interested in sustainability and energy. So it sets that up front. But from a HR and a communication perspective, it sets them a little bit of a challenge because it's quite deep, it's quite layered, right? It takes a bit of understanding to understand, what do we mean by that, right? That sounds great. What do you talk the talk? Do you walk the walk? So they ran this whole campaign on their intranet to add depth to that strategy. So clear values, but also the behaviors. And it's not just about it being a marketing slogan. This is what this behavior looks like in your role, in your location. So there's no doubt how you as an employee can embed those values. And so on their intranet, what they did is they ran a whole communication campaign, deep information about what this meant. But also they did little things like gamifying it, using things like quizzes and badges and recognition to get people involved. This quiz that they had here was particularly successful with the like younger generation, which increasingly looking for like meaning from work. And it's what they don't want to see is, oh yes, you communicated the vision you sold to me up front. That's not enough anymore. It needs to go deeper. Moving on from that, it's okay, now we got our organization to understand what our vision, our mission, our strategy, our values, our behaviors, we've ingrained it. How do we make sure that actually it's coming out the other end, that people are living those values? And so what they then did is use their intranet for peer-to-peer recognition. So anytime you spot a colleague, whether it's in your location or someone helped you out with someone, you can award a kudos or kind of like a cheers for peers type thing, to award that person and recognize them. But what for me is the most valuable part of this is people are putting in deep descriptions about why they awarded that. So if you look at their page on their intranet about their values, it's not just this is what our values are, this is the most recent person that's exhibited that value, and this is how they exhibited that value. So if I'm an employee looking on my intranet, I'm seeing best-in-class examples of people exhibiting those values, living them day to day. And so you kind of create this culture of slowly leveling up how we ingrain those values, because you're communicating best-in-class exhibition of it. And so when I'm doing my job, whether that's working on infrastructure in a field or whether that's working in an office, I can see what that looks like, and it starts to make it intrinsic. And my view here is that what I really love about this example is that we have this sometimes idea that like culture is socials and it's parties, and don't get me wrong, I love a party maybe too much, but it's not middle of the lane culture. We need to move towards direction where we're communicating something compelling and it's meaningful. And so what they're doing here is saying, this business isn't for everyone. It's for people that care about energy and sustainability. And so if you're here just to look for middle of the lane culture that everyone seems to be doing nowadays, like you somehow put in this equation and it says you have free pizza on a Friday and then you do this and then you do that and then that's culture. I totally disagree with that. I think it's about clarifying what our culture is, adding depth and layers to it, communicating it, and using things like the internet to ingrain it in different ways that you might not have thought about. And this is a final example that we have from them, which is, okay, so we've communicated it, we've made sure people understand it, we know people are living it day to day. How do we codify it? And by codify, I mean, how do we really ingrain it and catalog it and recognize people? And so what they did is the leadership team would review all of those nominations, those kudos nominations on their intranet, and pick out the ones that they thought were, wow, this is a really great example. And they then go to those people, interview them, the internal comms team would interview them, kind of like, if anyone remembers Humans of New York, you've kind of got it's about the people behind those values. How do they understand that value? Why they did that behavior? Why it was best in class? And so what you do is create this kind of culture of like recognizing not this is our vision and our mission, it's just communicated by leadership. Our strategy and our values is ground up. And so they catalog all those examples here and they release them over the year. And I think it's pretty cool. It starts to show this kind of like ground up culture. And because they deliver it at a local level and they get the local communicators to actually profile these people, what you get is this kind of afterglow of the winners, which is like people exhibiting the culture and then something, because it's like, hey, this person, did you hear so-and-so got recognized? And they give them these social cards that they can share on LinkedIn and Facebook and things like that. So it's like pretty cool in my opinion. And so I always want to make sure I come back to the impact of this. And I think this one speaks for itself, but how did it create a wave, and can you prove it in the data? And what they found was that one in 20 people in the organization got best in class nominations. So it's not like a little pocket of people that, oh, actually we found 5 people in the organization that are doing really great. It was 1 in 20 employees, and this is National Grid's heavily frontline organization, to have that much recognition for best in class exhibition of values and behaviors is really cool. What you see from these little graphs here is that it's not just, oh yeah, it was this one resort or it's one office, that it was just HQ. You've got equal spread against locations that they're located in, if that makes sense. But also across the different values and behaviors. And sometimes in an organization, you get something to do with great customer experience and it ignites that. But even here, the compliance stuff, super important for National Grid, doing the right thing. Are people doing their job safely, correctly? This is just as important for an organization like National Grid. And here's my little post-webinar checklist for your retention era. I'd say I kind of, just to hammer home this point around like clarify and codify, like do the work to understand what you mean and understand what it means in different types of roles. I think it could be easy. I mean, I'm a HQ worker. It can be easy to get HQ people in a room and say, oh, this is our culture, great. But actually, like, can we put people in different diverse role types that we have in the organization that are representative of the organization? and understand what they should be doing to exhibit that value. That's the depth I'm talking about. But also, like, it's not something that you, okay, woohoo, we refreshed our values, and now we're done for another few years. It's let's gather fast feedback at local levels to understand that stuff and give feedback on how we can improve it. So yeah, lots of cool different things here. I'm also quite passionate about rich employee personas. We work with a lot of enterprise organizations, and when people do employee personas and they show me what they've come up with, a lot of the time it looks like they've gone into ChatGPT and been like, give me a persona of a frontline worker. And it's far too simplistic. So think about the personality types that you have in different types of roles, the pain points, the perspective, like what sorts of people do you have in that role? What world do they see? What lens do they see the world through? Hopefully I've shown you loads of different examples there with an intranet from our customers. And I always want to make sure that it's not just me showing you Unily examples. These are me trying to look across our customer base and be like, that's cool, I'm going to talk about this. But I know from a resource perspective, you may be looking at that being like, whoa, that's going to take a lot of time and effort. And we do have some cool product features that support that. So if anyone's interested in the automation of that, we had a question about AI, and I know it's all the buzz at the moment. What we want to understand is how, from the tech perspective, set up what the optimum consistent experience looks like. How do we scale that? Well, part of that is to do with the tech. So happy to talk to you about that, whether you want a demo or alternatively just drop me a direct message or something, and we'll see if we can show you something cool to automate that. So that kind of concludes our presentation part. Now it's going to be all about Q&A. So for those of you that have questions to ask, whether it's for myself about the intranet and internal comms, or whether it's the chief people officer perspective with Jenny, feel free to put your questions in, upvote some questions that you think are interesting. Before we do that, I've actually got a couple of questions that I wanted to ask Jenny. The first one was really about, so I presented to you, we looked at the employee lifecycle, we identified opportunities. What do you think are maybe the one or two most overlooked opportunities for HR when it comes to an intranet? Because we saw that stat around people not thinking it's to do with HR. What do you think are the most overlooked opportunities for HR?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, and we've talked about some of them already. I definitely see a huge opportunity in relation to onboarding for the reasons I previously said, and scalability, consistency, just making, taking some of the lift away from people managers, first line managers, in order to be able to do that in a really effective way. But actually, it's the career development piece, which I think is the big one, because there's so many aspects to that. And I think if you move away from the mindset that an intranet is just where static information sits, like where a training course would sit or where training content would sit, and start to think about it in a much more dynamic way, as a tool to allow employees to self-serve in terms of considering their own career, what their development gaps and opportunities might be, accessing content, but also accessing network, accessing mentorship. I think there's a really big opportunity in there. Yeah,
I agree. It's one of those, it's funny because onboarding is one of those things, it's the most reliable and predictable part of the life cycle. Like, it's going to happen.
Everybody does onboarding. Yeah. Everybody gets that far.
Hopefully.
Everybody gets that far.
Yeah. And so, like, the fact that there's still such poor feedback in the research about it is like, we need to fix that problem. So yeah.
Well, agreed. And I think a big opportunity there, if you are going to come off this webinar and then start plotting out how you do it, the big thing is really to think about what employees need and when they need it, rather than what you want to tell them, because those two things are not always the same. And I think you can get quite smart, especially if you've got, if you are in the fortunate position to have a shared service center, for example, and you've got ticket information, or otherwise you can speak to your HR team and find out what are the questions that new hires ask. in their first few weeks or their first few months.
Yeah.
What are the things that they're not getting that just keep coming back, and we go, oh, here we go, we've had the email from such and such about how to sign up to the pension scheme or whatever it might be, you know. There are certain things which are predictable that people are going to want to know, and actually if you can build that in, imagine all the work that you take away later further down the line by just getting it to them in an efficient way.
Yeah. Okay, and then I've got one more question for you before I go to all.
There's lots of questions from the audience, so I don't want to talk too much.
Okay, cool. So actually, the one thing I want to ask, if you're coming from an internal comms background, if I'm an internal comms leader and you want to get HR more involved day to day, become a bit of a power couple, how would you recommend approaching that?
Well, I'm personally very data driven, so I would recommend finding those kind of, finding that joint interest or those areas where you can both lean in together via looking at, for example, your data around survey and figuring out what are the pain points for employees and how can we therefore work together to try and address that. I actually also think, I think the beauty of this webinar, I think the life cycle, that means a lot to HR people. It's a very common part of what we'd be talking about. So if you can frame your discussion in the context of the life cycle, I think that's that'll be a good starting point to be, because I think part of the challenge is always just talking the same language and figuring out what your shared goals are, your shared aspirations for success.
Great point. Totally agree. And I guess people joining this webinar is a good start. Let's move over to the audience Q&A. And there's one super popular question from Ramona, which is, how can we use the intranet to ensure employees remain engaged and productive when the company is going through change or restructure, when of course there's always a level of uncertainty? I've got a view here, but do you want to? I'm happy
to speak to it from an HR standpoint, certainly, and I think the fact that this has been so upvoted probably says a lot about what's happening out there at the moment. And I think again, the challenge, certainly from a people perspective, when there's change happening and uncertainty, restructuring is very, very difficult on everyone. And I think the challenge that you can be faced with is there is this uncertainty, there's difficult conversations happening, but you're also trying to run a business at the same time. People have to continue doing their day job. And I think the beauty of having an intranet in that kind of circumstance is you can make sure that you are providing the information that you have to provide around what's going on, whether it's negative, positive, or something in between. And you can make sure that's accurate, it's accessible, people are hearing the messaging consistently. Again, that word consistency, it's scalable. You're not trying to get individual emails sent out to people. That's great, but also at the same time, you can continue the day job and continue focusing on some of the positives that might still be happening in your organization at that time, or and continue, things like culture and community at times like that are even more important. And so I think there's a good opportunity to try and strike that balance in those times of upheaval, which are really, really difficult to manage.
No, I agree. It's funny because my instinct was to go for the communication part, the like internal comms perspective, and I've got a good example that I want to share, which is from a company called Dormer Carver. And they went through like a merger, and there sometimes can be a natural instinct to communicate the corporate message and then try to not communicate loads and just to avoid worriness. But actually, I feel like if that conversation isn't happening clearly online, then it's going to be happening offline. And so try to lean into the communication. What Dormer Carver did that I thought was really cool was that they set up a little change portal on their intranet, which was like, this is the purpose of this portal. And they essentially, what they did is they had the corporate articles written, but they would then basically rewrite them in straight talk, which was trying to break it down and trying to like simplify it, try to make sure that everyone understood it in plain English, or they're actually speak German, so play German. But and so like, and what was cool about that as well, they had a little form Q&A thing there where they basically run it like a little forum, like and it could be anonymous, meaning like, what's the thing that's on your mind? And we will write a little answer to ensure that because if you've got that question, no doubt other people will have that question. So they would pick up those questions from the form and then just publish little bits of content that would answer that. And so for me, it's like the more communication at those times, the better. And also the language and that you use as well is it can be your instinct can be to go towards like the legal compliance side, but also making sure people genuinely understand it, because obviously there is a compliance part of it. But yeah,
that's a good point.
So I've probably got time for a couple more questions. Let's go to this one. So from Tamara, also a super important question: who is moderating content across the intranet? How do you ensure information stays relevant and updated without it falling on one person, the team, usually the internal comms team, which is a one-man band? Yes, so one person band. So I used to actually be a product manager, and I actually worked on my content governance feature. I think the right tech can do the work for you here, which is, can we put rules in place which say that things are reviewed regularly? You don't want, it's funny, in the promo for this webinar, Jenny, you brought up a point, which is that the internet has sometimes a bit of a bad rep about being what did you call it, a place where content goes to die.
Well, that's what it used to. That's what it used to be. That's what I used to think about.
Yeah. And so
definitely,
like,
policies were in there that were written 5 years ago, and nobody's updated them.
And so for me, it's understanding the governance rules around that, and even if the tech isn't there for you, because I know in Unily, selfishly, we have those rules in place that mean that you can set for different types of content, whether it's policies, whether it's news articles, that there are rules in place that say this is reviewed every year, this is the person it goes to, this is the group it goes to. So that really supports, and there are automation rules in there which can auto unpublish as well, meaning it's not a person's role, but the intranet takes responsibility for it. But aside from that, it's also, you don't need to necessarily do it in the tech. It's understanding, do we have the right content governance rules in place? For me, there can be especially with intranets if you don't update the tech over time, you're probably dialing up the content. You've got people in there, you don't know who's got access, they're creating content, it's inconsistent. And you think, actually, to counter my last point, the communication is key, but it's also the relevancy. Is it being targeted at the right people? Is there too much on there? Actually, sometimes this is about a content quality point, and there can be people that come to you, which is like, hey, we've got this really important campaign or initiative, we need to write this and publish this. Actually, the more governance-y side of me would say, actually, we should have a limit on the amount we're publishing in a time period. And so if we're publishing, let's say 10 a week for argument's sake, you're having a conversation about quality, about relevancy. And so hopefully you're not just putting everything in there from the beginning so that over time it becomes a dumping ground. Let's qualify up front and make sure what's going in there is well written, it's good quality, and then we have the right governance to get rid of it at the right time.
Yeah.
And so this was a question I referenced. It was the first question in from Yasmin, which was, in 6 months from now, do we still need an intranet, or do we just have an AI-driven chatbot? My answer to that would be, you have both, because you have your AI-driven chatbot in your intranet. One of our we've got customers that we have like a chatbot as part of the platform. So it's about understanding the push and pull, which is, for me, there's a cool part of intranets, and that doesn't sound as great and loud when I say it, but in my head that sounded nicer. But there is this element of, like, we're talking about purpose, mission, vision, values, people being interested in sustainability and different topics. And so there's this element of, can people engage with all that content? Can people... One of the great things that I think intranets can be used for is ideas, like employee listening, pulse checks, and that's not always about pulling information towards you. That's we're a product business, and so we're in the business of building a great intranet software, and so our employees can actually give ideas internally on our intranet to say, hey, have we thought of this feature? And we can like upvote it, have conversation around it, and so that whole social element is intrinsic to what an intranet is. For me, it's that community culture. But of course, there's that element too.
I definitely think in there's almost an assumption that what we mean by intranet is a place where you just go to find information. And I think, we're saying that a new generation of intranet there's more to it than that, and it's a two-way street of information. It's where you go to look things up potentially, but it's also where you can make your opinion known or build community with through ERGs, or you can have information that's just one time of a particular moment in time, which is really useful too.
Yes. So we're at the top of the hour. There are some couple of cool questions here, but actually, so Dina and feel free to drop me a message. And the reporting capabilities are super important. You want to make sure you've got the right analytics there. So, but also there's a really great question here around like tacit knowledge, which for me, a big part of this is like profiles and understanding like ideas, for example, is tacit knowledge. The FAQ portal from Kersner that we saw earlier is starting to capture that tacit knowledge, democratize it. So it's not just in people's heads that you need to turn around your chair and ask that person. So many good questions. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you so much for attending. I'm going to thank Jenny as well, because I know you're super busy as the Chief People Officer of this organization. And I come to you like, hey, I really want to run a webinar with you.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me, Kaz.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So for those of you that want the checklist, we'll close this webinar off, and there'll be a little feedback form at the bottom of that. I'd love if you could fill that out, actually. That'd be great. But at the bottom of that page, you'll see ability to access and download the full checklist that were presented. So thank you so much for attending and also giving bloody great questions. So thank you, everyone. Until next time.